I never expected the man my father trusted most to become the person who changed my life. When Dad first told me I'd be spending the entire summer shadowing his business partner, I thought it was some kind of punishment. Ronald's taking over the new expansion project, Dad said over breakfast, without even looking up from his tablet. You'll learn more with him in 3 months than you would sitting in a classroom. I nearly laughed. I'm 23, Dad. I already have an internship. You have an internship making coffee. I do more than that. He finally looked at me with that expression every parent somehow masters, the one that says, "You're not fooling anyone." Ronald asked for someone dependable. I recommended you. That caught me off guard. He asked for me? He asked for someone young who actually wanted to learn. I volunteered your name. Not exactly. Dad and Ronald had been business partners for almost 20 years. Together, they had built one of the largest commercial construction firms in the state. Everyone knew Ronald. Clients respected him, employees admired him, competitors hated negotiating against him. He was calm, impossible to intimidate, and somehow always seemed 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I'd only met him a handful of times growing up. Company Christmas parties, a few charity dinners, the occasional barbecue. He'd always shake my hand, ask how school was going, remember details from conversations we'd had years earlier. Back then, he was just Dad's business partner. Nothing more, nothing less. At least that's what I believed. Monday morning, I pulled into the company parking lot 20 minutes early, mostly because I was nervous. The headquarters occupied 3 floors of a modern glass building downtown, and everything about it screamed success. People in expensive suits hurried through revolving doors carrying laptops and coffees. Luxury SUVs filled the executive parking spaces. I suddenly felt underdressed despite wearing my nicest button down. The receptionist smiled. "You must be Joshua." "That's me." "Mr. Ronald is expecting you." She didn't even have to call upstairs. That surprised me. A minute later, the elevator opened. There he was. Joshua. He smiled first, exactly as I remembered. Maybe a little older. Salt had begun creeping into his dark hair around the temples, but it suited him. He carried himself with quiet confidence instead of arrogance. Tailored navy suit, rolled sleeves, no tie. "Morning, sir," he laughed. "If you call me sir all summer, I'm going to feel ancient." "Sorry." Ronald works. He extended his hand. His handshake was firm but relaxed. "Ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." "Good answer." Instead of taking me to some empty office with orientation paperwork, he walked straight into a conference room filled with people. Everyone looked up. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ronald announced casually, "this is Joshua." A few smiled. Some nodded. One guy whispered something that made another laugh. Ronald noticed immediately. "If anyone has a problem with him being here," he said evenly, "bring it to me." Silence. The room changed instantly. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know about how much respect he commanded. He wasn't loud. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply expected to be listened to, and people listened. After the meeting ended, I finally asked, "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" "Defend me." "I wasn't defending you." He pressed the elevator button. "I was setting expectations." The doors opened. For them, not me. The first week flew by. Ronald wasn't the type to dump busy work on interns. Instead, he dragged me everywhere: construction sites, investor meetings, architect presentations, lunches with suppliers. He explained every decision he made. Sometimes I'd ask a question. Yay. Sometimes he'd ask me one. "What would you do?" "I don't know." "Take a guess." Eventually, I stopped worrying about being wrong. He never laughed when I made mistakes. Instead, he'd explain why another approach worked better. Somehow, that made me want to work even harder. Friday evening, everyone else had already left. I was finishing spreadsheets when Ronald walked past my desk. You still here? So are you. He smiled. Fair. He glanced at my monitor. You've been fixing that report for 40 minutes. It's not right. It doesn't have to be perfect. It should. He leaned against the cubicle wall. Joshua. Yeah? You know what the biggest mistake young professionals make? I shook my head. They think perfection earns respect. He folded his arms. It doesn't. What does? Consistency. I stared at him. He continued. Show up every day. Do honest work. Keep learning. Admit when you don't know something. People trust consistency. He smiled. They're suspicious of perfection. For some reason, that stuck with me. Not because it sounded clever, because I could tell he actually believed it. And over the next few weeks, I would slowly realize Ronald wasn't just teaching me how to build a career. He was teaching me how to become the kind of man I wanted to be. I just didn't know yet how much that lesson was going to change both of our lives. By the third week, I had settled into a routine. I'd arrive before 8 every morning, grab coffee from the cafe across the street, and spend the first half hour reviewing the notes Ronald had assigned me the day before. He believed every meeting was a chance to learn something. Don't just listen, he told me. Figure out why people say what they say. Most negotiations are about solving fears, not problems. At first, I thought it sounded like one of those motivational quotes executives loved repeating. Then I watched him in action. One afternoon, we met with a developer who seemed determined to reject every proposal our company made. Every suggestion Ronald offered was met with another objection. The numbers were right. The schedule worked. The designs were solid. Yet the client still wasn't convinced. When we got back to the elevator, I sighed. I don't get it. Ronald pressed the lobby button. What don't you get? He didn't like any of our ideas. He liked all of them. I frowned. Then, why keep saying no? Ronald smiled. Because he wasn't worried about the project. He was worried about looking foolish if it failed. I blinked. Tomorrow, Ronald continued, I'll show him how our plan protects his reputation, not just his investment. The next afternoon, that's exactly what happened. Within 20 minutes, the deal was signed. As we walked back to the car, I couldn't stop shaking my head. How did you know? I listened. To what? To what he didn't say. I laughed. I think you've got some kind of superpower. He chuckled. No. He unlocked the car. I've just made enough mistakes to recognize them earlier. The more time we spent together, the more I realized Ronald wasn't anything like the intimidating businessman people imagined. He remembered birthdays. He learned the names of every security guard. He thanked janitors. He asked receptionists how their families were doing. None of it felt forced. One morning, I asked him about it. You know everybody. He looked confused. I should. Most executives don't. Then most executives are making life harder than it needs to be. He shrugged. You can't build a company without people. Around the office, rumors spread constantly, mostly harmless ones. Ronald worked 80-hour weeks when he started. He turned down a buyout worth millions. He once fired a vice president after discovering he lied to an intern. Nobody knew which stories were true. I finally asked one afternoon while we were driving back from a site inspection. Can I ask you something? You just did. I rolled my eyes. You know what I mean. He laughed. Go ahead. Did you really turn down an offer to sell the company? He was quiet for a moment. I did. Why? The money would have been nice. So? I would have hated working for the people buying it. That answer surprised me. You could have retired. I wasn't trying to escape work. He glanced at me before looking back at the road. I enjoy building things. Not buildings, things, teams, careers, businesses, people. I was starting to understand that. Friday evening arrived with a surprise. As everyone packed up, Ronald appeared beside my desk. You busy tomorrow? I don't think so. Good. He handed me an address. Meet me there at 9. I looked down. It wasn't the office. It was a construction site outside the city. Wear boots. What are we doing? Getting dirty. Saturday morning was hot enough to make my shirt stick to my back before I'd even left the car. The site looked enormous. Steel beams stretched toward the sky. Concrete trucks rolled in and out. Workers in bright safety vests moved everywhere. Ronald was already there, except he wasn't wearing a suit, jeans, work boots, a faded company polo, safety helmet tucked under one arm. For the first time, he didn't look like an executive. He looked like the man who had built the company from the ground up. You made it. Barely. He handed me a hard hat. Come on. For the next 6 hours, we walked the site together. He introduced me to foremen who'd worked with him for 15 years, electricians who still called him by his first name, carpenters who joked with him like old friends. Nobody treated him differently because he owned part of the company. They respected him because he'd once done their jobs himself. During lunch, we sat on overturned buckets eating sandwiches. No conference room, no expensive restaurant, just two people watching cranes swing steel through the air. You know, I admitted, this is my favorite day so far. Ronald smiled. Mine too. I looked at him. Really? I don't get out here enough anymore. He watched the workers for a moment. This is where everything starts. There was something different about him today. More relaxed, less guarded. Like the office version of Ronald wore invisible armor that disappeared the second he stepped onto a job site. Late that afternoon, we finished walking the final section. As we headed back toward the parking lot, dark clouds rolled overhead. Seconds later, the rain came down in sheets. We both laughed and sprinted toward the temporary office trailer. By the time we made it inside, we were soaked. Ronald shook water from his hair. Well, he laughed. So much for staying dry. I couldn't help laughing, too. For a moment, there was no boss, no intern. Just two drenched men trying not to track mud across the trailer floor. He handed me a clean towel from a cabinet. Keep one in your car. You planned for this? I've been doing construction long enough to stop arguing with the weather. I dried my face. You always have an answer. No, he smiled. I just ask enough questions before making decisions. I looked at him for a second. You know, what? I was nervous about working with you. Were you? I thought you'd be impossible to impress. Ronald's expression softened. Joshua, I never wanted to impress you. You didn't? I wanted you to become confident enough that you stopped trying to. For some reason, that simple sentence stayed with me the entire drive home. Because for the first time since joining the company, I realized I wasn't just looking up to Ronald as my father's business partner anymore. I was beginning to admire the man himself. And I had no idea those feelings were about to become far more complicated. Monday morning felt different. Not because anything had changed, because I had. Somewhere between construction sites, long drives, and countless conversations, I'd stopped thinking of this as a temporary assignment. I actually looked forward to coming to work. When I stepped into the office, Ronald was already standing outside my desk. Good weekend? Yeah. You? He smiled. Quiet. He handed me a folder. I've got something new for you. Inside was a proposal for a mixed-use development the company had been pursuing for months. I want you to review it. I looked up. Just review it? No. He folded his arms. I want you to find everything that's wrong with it. I laughed. There has to be a catch. There is. What? You only have until this afternoon. I spent the next 4 hours reading every page. The proposal looked nearly perfect. Budgets, timelines, risk assessments, environmental studies. Everything seemed polished. When Ronald returned after lunch, he leaned against my desk. So, I couldn't find much. How much is much? I slid a notebook toward him. I marked 3 sections. He looked through my notes without saying a word. Then he nodded. You missed one. I knew it. But, he tapped the notebook. You caught something nobody else did. I blinked. What? The parking access. I almost didn't mention it. Why? I figured people with more experience would have already seen it. Ronald closed the folder. Joshua? Yeah? Never assume experience makes people infallible. He smiled. Fresh eyes solve old problems. That afternoon, Ronald invited me into his office for the first time. I had walked past it dozens of times. Large windows overlooked the city. Bookshelves lined one wall instead of awards. Family photographs sat beside architectural models. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress. One picture caught my attention. A younger Ronald stood beside my father at what looked like their very first construction site. Both were covered in dust. Both were laughing. You've known Dad a long time, Ronald looked over. 26 years. That's longer than I've been alive, he chuckled. Don't remind me. I picked up the photo. You two look happy. We were exhausted. He sat down across from me. But we believed we could build something together. And you did. We got lucky. I don't think luck builds companies. No, he smiled. But it helps when the right people find each other. Over the following weeks, I started noticing how much Ronald trusted me. He'd ask for my opinion during meetings. He'd let me present small portions of reports. Sometimes he'd even stay quiet just to see how I'd handle a difficult question. The first time it happened, I nearly froze. A supplier challenged one of our scheduling estimates. Instead of answering himself, Ronald looked at me. Joshua, every eye in the room turned toward me. My heart hammered. I explained the reasoning behind our timeline. The supplier asked another question, then another. By the end of the meeting, he'd agreed with our proposal. As everyone filed out, I let out a long breath. You planned that. Ronald smiled without denying it. You handled yourself well. I thought I was going to embarrass both of us. If I thought that, he picked up his notebook. I wouldn't have asked. Near the end of the month, Dad stopped by the office unexpectedly. He found us reviewing blueprints in a conference room. Interrupting? Not at all, Ronald answered. Dad looked at me. How's the internship? I smiled. It's not really an internship anymore. No? I'm actually learning. Dad laughed. I'll pretend I wasn't insulted. Ronald glanced between us. Joshua's doing well. Hearing those words meant more than I expected. Not because Ronald said them, because I knew he wouldn't say something he didn't believe. Dad nodded. I had a feeling he would. After he left, I looked at Ronald. You didn't have to say that. I wasn't doing you a favor. I know. He gave me a small smile. I was telling the truth. A few days later, we were driving back from another client meeting when traffic slowed to a crawl. Neither of us seemed in a hurry. Ronald rested one hand on the steering wheel. Can I ask you something? Sure. What do you actually want to do? I frowned. You mean after graduation? I mean 10 years from now. I stared out the windshield. I've honestly never been sure. No dream company? No. No 5-year plan? I laughed. I barely have a 5-week plan. He nodded thoughtfully. That's more common than you think. What about you? I knew exactly what I wanted. You did? I wanted to build something that lasted longer than I would. The answer hung in the quiet car. After a moment, I asked softly, Do you think you've done that? Ronald didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out at the skyline where several buildings carried the company's name. Finally, he said, I hope the buildings last. Then he glanced toward me. But I'd rather the people do. I wasn't completely sure what he meant. Not yet. The biggest surprise came the following Friday. Ronald walked into the conference room carrying two folders. One he placed in front of himself, the other he slid toward me. Open it. Inside was an invitation, a national leadership conference, 3 days, executives from across the country. My name was listed beneath his. I looked up in disbelief. You want me to go? I already registered you? Ronald, I think you're ready. For a conference full of CEOs? For seeing what's possible? I looked down at the invitation again. It felt unreal. I don't know what to say. He stood, gathering his notes. Say, you'll pack a suitcase. As he walked toward the door, he paused. Oh, I looked up. This trip isn't about watching. A small smile crossed his face. It's about participating. The door closed behind him. I sat there staring at the invitation, my pulse quickening. For the first time, I realized Ronald wasn't simply mentoring me anymore. He was opening doors I hadn't even known existed. And somewhere deep inside, I wanted to prove that his faith in me wasn't misplaced. The leadership conference was held in a hotel overlooking the harbor, nearly 3 hours from the city. I had never attended anything like it before. People in tailored suits moved through the lobby carrying leather briefcases, exchanging handshakes and conversations that sounded important before I'd even had my first coffee. Standing beside Ronald somehow made everything less intimidating. You look nervous, he said as we waited to check in. Is it that obvious? A little. I feel like I don't belong here. Ronald smiled. Neither did I my first time. You? Oh, absolutely. He accepted his room key from the receptionist. The difference is that nobody else knows it's your first conference. The first session was overwhelming. Executives discussed market trends, labor shortages, financing strategies, and technology that was changing the construction industry faster than anyone expected. I filled page after page with notes. During the lunch break, Ronald glanced at my notebook. You've written enough for a textbook. I don't want to forget anything, he laughed. You won't remember everything. So, what should I focus on? The questions. The questions? The answers change every year. He picked up his coffee. Good questions stay useful much longer. That afternoon, Ronald introduced me to more people than I could count. Presidents, architects, developers, investors. Every introduction was almost identical. This is Joshua. He's part of our team. Not an intern, not my partner's son, part of our team. It was a small difference, but I noticed apparently everyone else did too. Everyone. That evening, the conference hosted a networking reception. Soft music played while groups gathered around high tables overlooking the water. I was halfway through a conversation with an engineering consultant when someone tapped Ronald on the shoulder. Ronald, an older man with silver hair, extended his hand. I haven't seen you in years. They laughed like old friends. After a few minutes, the man turned toward me. And who's this? Before I could answer, Ronald spoke. This is Joshua, my newest protege. The word caught me off guard. Protege. The older man smiled knowingly. You're the lucky one. I looked between them. I'm sorry? He chuckled. Ronald doesn't invest time in many people. Then he excused himself. I watched him disappear into the crowd before quietly asking, what did he mean? Ronald took a sip of sparkling water. He meant exactly what he said. You really don't mentor many people? He shook his head. I'd rather do it properly than do it often. Later that night, after the reception ended, we stepped outside onto the hotel's terrace. The harbor lights reflected across the water. A cool breeze finally cut through the summer heat. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. It was comfortable, not awkward, just quiet. Ronald rested his hands on the railing. I've been meaning to ask you something. Okay, are you enjoying this? I laughed. The conference? The work? I looked out across the water. I think so. You think so? I know I enjoy learning. I hesitated. And, and, I've never had someone actually believe I could do more. Ronald was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, Joshua, I've never once believed you couldn't. I looked over at him. His expression hadn't changed. He wasn't trying to flatter me. He was simply stating a fact. You've earned every opportunity I've given you. I still have a lot to learn. So do I. That surprised me. You? He smiled faintly. The day I think I've learned everything, he looked back toward the water, is probably the day I should retire. The second day of the conference ended with an awards dinner. Companies from across the country were recognized for innovation and leadership. Toward the end of the evening, Ronald's name was announced. He received an Industry Leadership Award. The ballroom erupted in applause. As he walked to the stage, I realized something. He genuinely looked uncomfortable with the attention. His acceptance speech lasted barely 3 minutes. This company was never built by one person, he said. It belongs to every employee who shows up before sunrise, every foreman who solves problems nobody else sees, every apprentice willing to learn, and every mentor willing to teach. He paused. I've been fortunate to have all of them in my life. Then he stepped away from the microphone. No dramatic ending, no long list of accomplishments, just gratitude. When he returned to the table, I leaned closer. You hate speeches. He smiled. I prefer conversations. I noticed. The drive home the next afternoon felt quieter than usual. Both of us were tired. About halfway back, Ronald broke the silence. What was the biggest thing you learned? I thought for a moment. Honestly, I'd hope so. I smiled. I expected successful people to have all the answers. And they don't. No, they just ask better questions. Ronald laughed. I may have said something like that before. Probably. We shared an easy laugh. After another mile or two, he spoke again. You know, what? Your father called me yesterday. I glanced over. He did? He asked how you were doing. What did you tell him? Ronald kept his eyes on the road. I told him I underestimated you. I blinked. You underestimated me? I thought I'd be teaching someone interested in business. He looked at me briefly. I didn't expect to find someone genuinely curious. I wasn't sure what to say. So, I managed. That's a good thing? It's an excellent thing? The rest of the drive passed in thoughtful silence. As the city's skyline appeared on the horizon, I found myself realizing something I hadn't admitted even to myself. Somewhere along the way, Ronald had stopped feeling like my father's business partner. He had become the person whose opinion mattered most to me. And while I still saw him as a mentor, I was beginning to wonder whether those feelings would always remain that simple. The conference was over, but something had changed between us, not in a dramatic way. There wasn't some life-altering conversation or defining moment. Instead, our conversations became easier, longer, more personal. It started during a drive to another construction site a few weeks later. Ronald switched off the radio halfway there. You've been quieter lately, I smiled. I was thinking. About? What happens after the summer? He nodded slowly. I figured that was on your mind. I don't really want to go back to making coffee somewhere. He laughed. I can understand that. I actually enjoy this. The work, the people, I paused, and learning from you. He glanced at me before returning his eyes to the road. I'm glad. The project we'd been working on finally broke ground. Everyone involved gathered for the ceremony: city officials, investors, architects, the press. I expected to stand somewhere in the background. Instead, Ronald waved me over. Stand with us. I'm just helping. You've earned your place here. Before I could argue, he introduced me to another executive. This is Joshua. He's been instrumental in preparing this project. Instrumental? I hadn't expected that. I wasn't even sure I deserved it. After the ceremony ended, several employees stopped to congratulate me. One of the project managers smiled. You've got one of the best teachers in the business. I know, he laughed. Don't waste it. I won't. Later that afternoon, Ronald and I escaped the crowd by walking through the unfinished site. Concrete foundations stretched across the property. Heavy equipment rumbled in the distance. Everything smelled like fresh earth after the morning rain. You looked uncomfortable earlier, Ronald said. When? When everyone applauded? I laughed. I wasn't expecting attention. Most people enjoy recognition. I'd rather earn respect. He looked at me thoughtfully. Good. Good? Recognition comes and goes. He stepped over a muddy patch. Respect lasts. As summer moved toward its final month, I found myself noticing little things about Ronald. The way he always arrived early, how he carried a notebook instead of relying on his phone, how he never interrupted someone who was speaking, the way he smiled more with his eyes than with his mouth. None of those things had anything to do with business. They were simply him. One evening, we stayed late preparing for a presentation. By the time we finished, the office was almost empty. I stretched and glanced at the clock. 9:30. Ronald looked up. We've been here longer than I thought. You hungry? He hesitated. I could eat? We ended up at a quiet diner a few blocks away. Nothing fancy, just burgers, fries, and coffee. It felt strangely normal, not like dinner with the owner of a multi-million-dollar company. Just two people unwinding after a long day. Halfway through the meal, Ronald smiled. I've never asked. What? What made you study business? I laughed. I honestly wasn't passionate about it. No? It seemed practical. What would have been your first choice? I thought for a moment. Architecture? His eyebrows lifted. Really? I like designing things. So, why didn't you? I shrugged. I wasn't sure I was good enough. Ronald leaned back in the booth. That's a shame. You think so? I think too many talented people talk themselves out of trying. His words settled over the table. For some reason, they hit harder than I expected. A week later, Dad invited Ronald over for dinner. That wasn't unusual. They'd been doing it for years. What was unusual was how differently I saw the evening. Instead of watching two business partners discuss contracts, I found myself noticing the friendship underneath it. They teased each other, finished each other's stories, argued about baseball, laughed over memories from decades earlier. At one point, Dad stepped outside to answer a phone call, leaving Ronald and me alone in the kitchen. He looked around the room and smiled. Your mother still makes the best lasagna. She'll be happy to hear that. He nodded toward the living room. Your father seems proud. Proud? Of you. I blinked. He hasn't said anything. He doesn't have to. Ronald smiled. I've known him a long time. You can tell? I can. That simple observation meant more to me than I expected. The following Friday, just before everyone left for the weekend, Ronald stopped by my desk. Got a minute? Sure. We walked into his office. He closed the door behind us. That immediately made me wonder if I'd done something wrong. He noticed my expression and laughed softly. Relax. I wasn't worried. You looked worried. Maybe a little. He opened a folder and slid a document across the desk. I looked down. It was an employment offer, full-time, after graduation. I stared at it for several seconds. I, my voice caught. I don't know what to say. You don't have to answer today. I looked back up. You want me to stay? I wouldn't be offering otherwise. I thought, what? I thought this was just a summer placement because of Dad. Ronald's expression became unusually serious. Joshua, his voice was calm. I gave you opportunities because your father trusted you. He paused. I'm offering you a career because I trust you. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Every insecurity I'd carried into that first day seemed to disappear all at once. Not because I suddenly believed I was perfect, because someone I deeply respected believed I belonged. I finally managed a smile. I'd like to accept. Ronald stood and extended his hand. Then welcome to the team. I shook it. His grip was as steady as it had been on my first day. But this time, it felt different, not because he'd changed, because I had. Walking out of his office with that signed offer in my hands, I realized something I'd been trying not to admit for weeks. Ronald was still my mentor. He was still my father's closest friend. He was still the man I admired more than anyone else. But somewhere along the way, admiration had quietly become something deeper, something I wasn't ready to put into words, and I had no idea whether I ever should. I accepted the offer on a Friday. By Monday morning, the office somehow felt different, not because anyone treated me differently, because I finally stopped feeling like I was borrowing someone else's future. For the first time, I wasn't just Joshua, the owner's son. I was part of the company, and Ronald made sure everyone knew it. During our weekly management meeting, he looked around the table before speaking. Joshua will be assisting with the Riverside project. One of the senior managers raised an eyebrow. Leading the reports? He'll be preparing them. The room was quiet for a second. Then Ronald added calmly, and presenting them. Nobody argued. After the meeting ended, I caught up with him in the hallway. You didn't warn me. I know. I've never presented to the whole management team. You've presented to clients. That's different. He smiled. It is? Then why? Because you're ready. The presentation was 2 weeks away. Ronald didn't prepare it for me. He prepared me for it. Every afternoon, we'd spend an hour in an empty conference room. He'd interrupt me halfway through. Start again. Why? You lost confidence when someone asked a question? Another day, he'd stop me after 5 minutes. You're reading the slides. I wrote them. I know. So? They already know how to read. I laughed. You're impossible. I've been called worse. Little by little, I improved. Not because he made it easier, because he expected more from me every single day. One evening, after another practice session, we walked toward the parking garage together. The building was nearly empty. You've changed, Ronald said. I looked over. What do you mean? You don't apologize every time you answer a question anymore. I laughed. I used to do that? Constantly. I didn't notice. I did? He unlocked his car but didn't get in immediately. You've started trusting yourself. I think that's because someone kept making me explain my ideas, he smiled. That was intentional. I know. We stood there for a moment in the quiet garage. I never thanked you. For what? For seeing something in me before I did? Ronald looked genuinely surprised. You did the work, Joshua. Maybe. But you gave me the chance. His expression softened. Everyone deserves someone who believes in them. For some reason, those words stayed with me long after we drove away. A few days later, Dad invited me to lunch. It had been weeks since we'd spent time alone. As soon as we ordered, he smiled across the table. Ronald tells me you're making him proud. I nearly choked on my drink. He said that? He doesn't hand out compliments very often. I looked down for a second. He's taught me a lot. Dad nodded. He taught me too. That surprised me. I always assumed you two built the company together. We did, but there were years I doubted myself. You? He laughed. More than once. What happened? Ronald reminded me why we started. Dad leaned back. He's always had a way of seeing potential before other people do. I smiled quietly. I've noticed. I've. Dad watched me for a second longer than usual. I'm glad you two get along. So am I. The presentation finally arrived. I barely slept the night before. By 9 o'clock, the conference room was full. Department heads, project managers, executives. Ronald sat near the back, notebook closed, watching. He wasn't there to rescue me. He was there because he believed I didn't need rescuing. Halfway through, one executive challenged one of my projections. The old version of me would have panicked. Instead, I answered. He asked another question. I answered that too. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping. Others joined in. I looked toward the back. Ronald wasn't clapping. He was simply smiling. It was small, almost impossible to notice, but somehow it meant more than the applause. That evening, Ronald stopped by my desk as everyone was leaving. Dinner? I looked up. Celebrating? You earned it. We returned to the same little diner we'd visited weeks earlier. The waitress recognized us immediately. The usual? Ronald smiled. Please. After our food arrived, he raised his glass. Congratulations, I laughed. I've never toasted with iced tea before. There's a first time for everything. We clinked glasses. After a few bites, he became unusually thoughtful. I've been thinking. About what? My role? I frowned. What about it? You won't need me forever. I immediately shook my head. I'll always need your advice, he smiled. Advice, maybe? But not direction. The thought unsettled me more than I expected. I don't like the sound of that. Why? Because I stopped myself. He waited patiently. I've gotten used to working with you. Ronald looked down at his coffee. So have I. The words were simple, but something about the way he said them made the silence between us feel different, warmer, more personal. Neither of us rushed to fill it. As we walked back toward our cars, the city lights reflected off the sidewalks after a light evening rain. Ronald stopped beside his car. You've accomplished a lot this summer. I couldn't have done it alone. No, he smiled gently, but you could do the next part. I looked at him. The next part? Building your own career. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and then he reached out and squeezed my shoulder. A simple gesture, brief, natural, yet somehow it lingered long after he stepped away. As I watched his taillights disappear into the night, I finally admitted something to myself that I had spent weeks trying to ignore. My admiration for Ronald had become something much deeper. I still respected him. I still looked up to him. But now, I also had to figure out what to do with feelings I had never expected to have. And I couldn't help wondering whether I was the only one trying so hard to hide them. For the next several days, I did what any sensible person would do. I convinced myself I was imagining everything: the longer conversations, the comfortable silences, the dinners after work, the way Ronald always seemed to notice when something was bothering me before I'd said a word. None of that meant anything. He was my mentor. He was my father's closest friend. And he was, without question, one of the most professional people I'd ever met. So I buried those feelings where they belonged, or at least I tried. A few weeks later, the company hosted its annual employee appreciation picnic. Families filled the park. Kids ran between tables. Someone had organized volleyball. Another group stood around the barbecue arguing about whose turn it was to cook. It was nothing like the office. Ronald arrived wearing jeans and a navy polo instead of a suit. He looked younger somehow, more relaxed. Employees walked up to him constantly, not because they had problems, because they genuinely wanted to talk to him. I watched him spend 15 minutes helping one employee's daughter build a kite she'd bought at one of the activity booths. Another 10 minutes listening to a new apprentice explain his plans for trade school. He gave everyone the same thing, his full attention. No wonder people respected him. Joshua, I turned. Dad handed me 2 bottles of water. You've been staring. What? He smirked. Nothing. I felt my face warm. I was just watching Ronald solve another crisis? I looked over. The crisis turned out to be a little boy crying because he'd lost his stuffed dinosaur. Within minutes, Ronald had recruited half the maintenance crew into a search party. 5 minutes later, the dinosaur was found. The little boy hugged him so hard everyone nearby laughed. Dad smiled. That's him. What do you mean? He never thinks something is too small to matter. Near sunset, people slowly began heading home. Ronald was helping fold tables when I walked over. You know there are people hired to do that. I know. He stacked another chair. But they were here all day too. Without thinking, I grabbed the chairs beside him. For the next half hour, we cleaned up together. When we finally finished, we stood looking across the now empty park. It was a good day, I said. It was. You know, I hesitated. I don't think I've ever met someone everyone genuinely likes. He laughed. I'm sure somebody dislikes me. I haven't found them. They're probably just being polite. I smiled. I doubt it. The following Monday brought unexpected news. Ronald asked me to stop by his office before lunch. As soon as I sat down, he slid another folder toward me. I've accepted an invitation to speak at a university leadership program. Congratulations. I'd like you to come with me. I looked up. As your assistant, as my colleague. The single word caught me completely off guard. Ronald, you've earned it. The university event went well. After Ronald finished speaking, students surrounded him with questions. Eventually, one of them turned toward me. How long have you worked together? I answered before thinking. Only a few months. The student looked genuinely surprised. I thought it had been years. Why? The way you interact. He shrugged. You seem to understand each other. I laughed it off, but his comment stayed with me, because he wasn't entirely wrong. Sometimes Ronald only had to look at me across a meeting room, and I'd know exactly what he wanted me to do. And apparently, other people noticed. The drive home was quiet until Ronald suddenly spoke. Can I ask you something? Always. What changed? I frowned. I'm not sure what you mean. You've been keeping your distance. My stomach tightened. I have? A little? I didn't realize. He nodded slowly. I wasn't sure if I'd done something. The disappointment in his voice hit me harder than I expected. No, I answered immediately. You didn't. Then what is it? I looked out the passenger window. How could I possibly answer that? Because somewhere along the way, I started falling for you? Because every time we spend time together, I have to remind myself why nothing can ever happen? Instead, I settled on the safest answer. I've just been thinking about the future. Ronald accepted that explanation with a small nod. I understand. But somehow, I wasn't convinced he believed me. A few evenings later, I stayed late finishing reports. The office was almost empty when Ronald appeared in the doorway. You'll miss dinner if you keep working. I looked at the clock, nearly 8. I lost track of time. I noticed. He held up 2 takeout bags. I took the liberty. You brought food? I remembered you mentioning this place. We ate in the conference room overlooking the city. No presentations, no laptops, just dinner. Halfway through the meal, Ronald set his fork down. I've been meaning to tell you something. I looked up. What? When your father first asked me to mentor you? I smiled. You said yes because you owed him a favor? He laughed. I said yes because I trust him. And now? His expression softened. Now I'd say yes even if he never asked. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The lights from the city reflected against the windows behind him. You've become important to this company? He paused. And his eyes met mine. To me. My heartbeat stumbled. He had probably meant it as a mentor, as a friend, as someone he cared about professionally, but hearing those words from him made it almost impossible to keep pretending my own feelings hadn't grown far beyond admiration. I looked down at my untouched coffee, trying to steady myself, because I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I told Ronald how I really felt, everything between us could change. I just didn't know whether it would be for the better or whether I'd lose the most important person I'd ever met. I barely slept that night. Not because Ronald had confessed anything, he hadn't. He'd simply said I'd become important to him. A sentence that could have meant 100 different things. A mentor caring about his student. A friend appreciating another friend. A business partner recognizing potential. Only my heart insisted on hearing something more. By morning, I decided on one thing. I wasn't going to risk everything we'd built by imagining feelings that might not exist. If all Ronald ever wanted from me was a professional relationship, then I would protect that. He deserved at least that much. For the next couple of weeks, I focused entirely on work. The Riverside project was moving ahead. New proposals kept arriving. Meetings filled nearly every afternoon. On paper, everything was normal. But Ronald noticed. Of course, he noticed. One Friday evening, after everyone else had gone home, he knocked softly on my open office door. You have a minute? Always. He stepped inside and closed the door. I've been watching you. I laughed nervously. That sounds ominous. You've been working harder than usual, I guess, and smiling less. I looked away. I'm just tired. No. His voice remained calm. You're carrying something. The silence stretched between us. Finally, I sighed. You really don't miss much. I try not to. He pulled out the chair across from my desk and sat down. No meetings, no deadlines. Just talk to me. For several long seconds, I couldn't. Every possible outcome played through my mind. If I told him, I could lose him. If I didn't, I'd spend who knew how long pretending everything was fine. Finally, I spoke. Do you remember asking me what I wanted 10 years from now? He nodded. I do. I didn't know the answer then. And now? I smiled sadly. I know. He waited. I want to become someone I'm proud of. A small smile crossed his face. I think you're well on your way. I shook my head. That's only part of it. The room felt impossibly quiet. I also, my voice caught, I've started feeling something I never expected. Ronald didn't interrupt, didn't rush me, didn't rescue me. I admire you, I swallowed. I respect you. Another breath. And somewhere along the way, I finally forced myself to meet his eyes. I fell in love with you. The words hung between us. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. For the first time since we'd met, I couldn't read Ronald's expression. Finally, I stood. I'm sorry. He looked up. I shouldn't have said that. Joshua, I know. I forced a weak smile. You've never done anything inappropriate. This isn't your responsibility. I picked up my jacket. I just needed to be honest. As I reached the door, Ronald quietly said my name. I stopped, but I couldn't turn around, not yet. Please, he said softly, look at me. I did. His expression wasn't shocked or angry. It was simply thoughtful. I've spent weeks asking myself why you've been pulling away. He stood slowly. I hoped it wasn't this. My heart sank. I understand. You don't. He took a careful step closer. I hoped it wasn't this. He smiled sadly. Because I was asking myself the same questions. I stared at him. What? I've been fighting this longer than you know. I couldn't breathe. He continued carefully. You're your own man. My respect for you has nothing to do with your father. My admiration has nothing to do with work. He paused. And that's exactly why I was terrified. Neither of us spoke for what felt like forever. Finally, I managed, you felt it too? A quiet nod. For longer than I wanted to admit. But I glanced toward the hallway. My dad. Ronald sighed. I know. The company. I know. Everything. I know. He smiled gently. That's why I never crossed a line. I laughed through suddenly wet eyes. I thought I was imagining everything. So did I. The following weekend, Ronald asked if I'd meet him somewhere. Not the office, not a restaurant, the same construction site where he'd first taken me months earlier. Most of the building was finished now. Steel had become glass, concrete had become offices. Workers were putting the final touches on the lobby. We stood on the rooftop overlooking the city. Funny, I said. The first time we came here, there wasn't much to see. Ronald smiled. There was. What? A foundation? The meaning wasn't lost on either of us. After a long silence, he spoke. If we do this, he looked at me, we do it properly. No secrets? There will have to be some privacy, he admitted honestly. But no lies, no games, no favoritism. I nodded. I don't want people questioning every opportunity I earn. They won't. He smiled. Because if this happens, he paused, I'll no longer be your mentor. I blinked. What? I've already spoken with the board. My eyes widened. You what? They agreed another executive should oversee your development. You planned all this? I hoped. He laughed softly. I wasn't sure. But I wasn't willing to put either of us in an impossible position. I stared at him. You really thought of everything. No. He smiled. I just asked enough questions. I couldn't help laughing. The exact lesson he'd taught me on one of our first days together. Telling my father was, without question, the hardest conversation of my life. He listened without interrupting. When we finally finished, he leaned back in his chair. I've known Ronald almost 30 years. Neither of us spoke. I've also known when he cares about someone. Dad looked directly at me. I figured something had changed. You knew? I suspected. He smiled faintly. What mattered to me wasn't whether you cared about each other. It was whether you respected each other. Ronald answered before I could. Always. Dad nodded. Then don't make me regret trusting either of you. Relief hit me so hard I nearly laughed. Months later, life looked different. Another executive had officially become my supervisor. Ronald and I kept our relationship professional during work hours. No special treatment, no shortcuts, no exceptions. Outside the office, we built something entirely our own, slowly, honestly, the same way Ronald had taught me to build everything else. One evening, we stood once again on the rooftop of that completed building. The sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the city. I looked over at him. You know, what? When I first came to work for you, I thought Dad was punishing me. Ronald laughed. I remember. I had no idea he was changing my life. Ronald reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he smiled. What was the biggest lesson you learned? I looked out over the city we'd spent months helping shape. Then, back at the man who had shaped me even more. That the strongest foundations, I squeezed his hand gently, aren't the ones made of concrete. They're the ones built on trust. Ronald smiled, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no fear of what came next. Because our story had never really been about falling in love. It had been about becoming the kind of men who were ready for it,